The smoke didn't come from outside. Marcus Chen pressed his face against the cold glass of Lookout Tower 7, watching tendrils of gray vapor seep through the floorboards beneath his feet. The acrid smell filled his nostrils. Not the familiar scent of burning pine or wildfire, but something else. Something that made his stomach turn and his skin crawl with an inexplicable dread. It was 3:47 a.m. on his 32nd day as a fire lookout in Glacier National Park, and the smoke was rising from inside his cabin. The radio crackled with static cutting through the suffocating silence that had plagued the mountains for weeks. No wind, no animal sounds, nothing but the oppressive weight of something watching from the darkness below. Marcus had taken this job to escape the chaos of city life to find peace in the wilderness. But peace was the last thing he'd found up here 7 miles from the nearest trail, surrounded by an ocean of dense forest that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. The smoke continued to rise, forming shapes in the dim light of his emergency lantern. Shapes that almost looked like reaching hands. His radio suddenly burst to life. "Tower 7, this is base. Do you copy? We're getting some unusual readings from your sector." Marcus grabbed the handset with trembling fingers, his voice barely a whisper. "Base, this is Tower 7. I think I need immediate evacuation." Welcome back to the channel, fellow horror enthusiasts. Before we dive into tonight's true story, let me ask, where are you watching from? Are you somewhere safe, or are you alone in the dark like our friend Marcus was? Hit that like button if you're brave enough to continue. Subscribe for more terrifying true stories, and drop a comment below. But only if you dare. Tonight's tale comes from the isolated wilderness of Montana, where the only thing scarier than a wildfire is what lurks in the smoke itself. 3 weeks earlier, Marcus Chen had driven his beat-up Honda Civic up the winding mountain roads of Glacier National Park, leaving behind a failed startup, a broken engagement, and a therapist who'd suggested he reconnect with nature to heal his anxiety disorder. At 28, he'd felt like his life was burning down around him, so the irony of taking a job preventing actual fires wasn't lost on him. The job posting had been straightforward: 60 days of solitude in Lookout Tower 7, monitoring weather patterns and scanning for signs of wildfire during what meteorologists predicted would be an exceptionally dry summer. The pay was decent, the isolation complete, and the nearest human contact was Ranger Station Alpha, 23 miles away by a dirt road that washed out regularly. Marcus had arrived at the tower on June 15th, hauling supplies up the final 300 yards of trail that was too narrow for vehicles. Tower 7 stood 40 feet tall, a weathered wooden structure perched on a rocky outcrop that offered a panoramic view of the Whitefish Range. The cabin at the top was sparse but functional. A bed, desk, radio equipment, weather instruments, and large windows on all 4 sides. His supervisor, Chief Ranger Barbara Martinez, had given him a thorough briefing over the radio on his first day. "You'll do hourly weather reports during peak fire season, daily equipment checks, and maintain a log of anything unusual," she'd explained, her voice crackling through the static. "The tower's been empty for 2 seasons since the last guy. Well, let's just say some people aren't cut out for the isolation." The first week had been exactly what Marcus needed. He fell into a routine wake at dawn: check instruments, radio, and reports, read books, cook simple meals, and watch the sunset paint the mountains in brilliant oranges and purples. The silence was profound, but healing. He began to sleep better than he had in years. But by the second week, Marcus noticed things that made him uneasy. The forest was too quiet, even for wilderness standards. He'd been an Eagle Scout and had spent plenty of time in the outdoors, but this silence felt unnatural. No bird songs, no rustling of small animals, not even the buzz of insects. It was as if something had driven all life away from his sector of the park. Then there were the shadows. During his routine visual sweeps of the forest, Marcus would catch glimpses of movement between the trees. Dark shapes that seemed too large to be animals, but moved with a fluid, purposeful gait. When he focused his binoculars on these spots, he found nothing but empty forest. He attributed it to eye strain and the mind's tendency to create patterns where none existed. The weather had been unnaturally calm as well. Chief Martinez had warned him about the dry conditions, but what unsettled Marcus was the complete absence of wind. The forest stood motionless day after day like a photograph. The air itself seemed thick, oppressive, as if the atmosphere was holding its breath. By the third week, Marcus had started talking to himself just to break the silence. He'd always been comfortable with solitude, but this felt different. It felt like being watched. The first truly disturbing incident occurred on day 21, during what had become Marcus's routine midnight equipment check. He'd developed insomnia, partly from the eerie silence, partly from a nagging sense that something in the forest was aware of his presence. Sleep came only in short bursts, usually just before dawn. He was adjusting the weather station's wind vane when he heard it, a sound like fabric tearing, but impossibly loud and long, echoing from somewhere deep in the valley below. The sound lasted nearly 30 seconds, rising and falling in pitch like a massive predator's call. Marcus grabbed his binoculars and scanned the darkness, but the forest revealed nothing. When he radioed base about the sound, Chief Martinez's response was oddly casual. "Probably just a tree falling, Chen. Old growth forests make all kinds of noises. Don't let your imagination run wild up there." But Marcus knew the sound of falling trees, and this wasn't it. This had been organic, almost vocal. He spent the rest of the night staring into the forest, waiting for the sound to repeat. It never did. 3 days later, during his afternoon visual sweep, Marcus spotted something that made his blood run cold. Through his binoculars focused on a clearing about 2 miles northeast, he saw what appeared to be a perfect circle of dead trees. The trees weren't burned or diseased. They were gray, desiccated, standing like skeletal sentinels around a patch of bare earth. What disturbed Marcus most was that he'd looked at that exact spot dozens of times before and was certain the trees had been healthy and green. He checked his logs, confirming his suspicion. In his detailed notes from just 5 days earlier, he'd specifically noted the vibrant green canopy in that area. Trees didn't die and decay that quickly, especially not in perfect geometric patterns. That evening, as Marcus prepared his daily report, he noticed movement in the dead circle. Something large and dark was moving among the skeletal trees, too large to be any native wildlife. He watched through binoculars as the shape seemed to flow between the trees like smoke, but with purposeful direction. When he tried to radio base about it, his equipment malfunctioned, producing only static and a low rhythmic humming that sounded almost like breathing. The malfunction lasted exactly 47 minutes. Marcus timed it. On day 26, Marcus woke to find footprints in the dirt around the base of his tower. They were unlike anything he'd seen before, roughly humanoid but wrong in every detail. Too long, too narrow, with what appeared to be 6 toes ending in sharp points. The prints circled the tower 3 times before heading directly into the thickest part of the forest. Marcus photographed the prints with his phone and tried to upload them when he had satellite coverage, but every photo came out as digital static. The phone's camera worked perfectly for everything else, but those specific images wouldn't save or transmit. He began checking his perimeter every morning, finding the same strange prints in different configurations. Sometimes they formed spirals, sometimes straight lines pointing toward his tower. They appeared even on nights when Marcus was certain he'd stayed awake and alert. The psychological pressure was mounting. Marcus found himself jumping at shadows, constantly checking the radio, obsessively documenting every minor anomaly. He'd called his ex-fiancée, Sarah, twice, but her concern only made him feel more isolated. How could he explain that something in the forest was playing games with him? Chief Martinez's responses to his reports grew increasingly dismissive. "Chen, you need to stay focused on fire prevention, not chasing shadows. The isolation gets to everyone eventually. Just stick to your job." But Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that his job had somehow become secondary to something else entirely. Something that wanted him to witness what was happening in the forest. Something that was slowly revealing itself, one impossible occurrence at a time. The pattern escalated on day 29. Marcus woke to find his equipment rearranged, not damaged, but deliberately moved. The weather station's instruments were facing inward toward his cabin instead of outward toward the valley. His radio had been tuned to a frequency that produced only that same low rhythmic humming. His binoculars were positioned on the windowsill, focused on his own reflection in the opposite window. Someone or something had been in his cabin while he slept, handling his equipment with careful precision, leaving everything functional but subtly wrong. The door had still been locked from the inside. That night, Marcus didn't sleep at all. He sat in his chair with a flashlight and a knife he'd brought for preparing food, watching every shadow, listening to every sound. The forest remained silent, but the silence itself had become a presence, heavy, expectant, and utterly malevolent. At 3:15 a.m., the smoke began rising through his floorboards. The smoke that rose through the floorboards carried the wrong scent. Marcus had spent enough time around campfires and wildfires to recognize the smell of burning wood. But this was something else entirely. Organic, but not plant matter, with an underlying sweetness that reminded him of rotting fruit mixed with burning hair. The tendrils moved with purpose, swirling in patterns that defied the cabin's ventilation. Marcus dropped to his knees, pressing his face to the floor to peer through the gaps between boards. Below, in the space between the cabin floor and the support beams, something was moving. Not flames, but shapes that shifted and writhed like living things made of shadow and smoke. They seemed aware of his presence, flowing toward wherever he looked as if drawn to his attention. He grabbed his radio, hands shaking as he tried to raise bass. The static was worse now, punctuated by sounds that almost resembled whispers. Not quite words, but rhythmic and intentional. When he finally managed to reach Chief Martinez, her voice sounded different, distant, and hollow. Tower 7, the weather station shows normal atmospheric pressure in your area. Are you sure you're seeing smoke? It's coming from inside the cabin, Marcus insisted, watching the gray tendrils continue to seep upward. Something's under the floor. That's not possible, Chen. The tower was inspected before you arrived. There's nothing combustible in that space except structural support. But as she spoke, Marcus noticed something that made his stomach drop. The smoke was forming letters spelling words across his cabin floor in elegant flowing script, WESEEYOU. The words held for nearly 10 seconds before dissolving back into formless gray mist. Marcus blinked hard, convinced he was hallucinating from sleep deprivation and stress. But then new words formed, YOUCANNOTLEAVE. Martinez, something's writing messages in the smoke. It's communicating. The radio went dead. Not static, complete silence, as if someone had cut the power. Marcus frantically tried different frequencies, but every channel was empty. His phone showed no signal, which wasn't unusual at the tower, but the display kept flickering with symbols he didn't recognize. Angular marks that hurt to look at directly. Over the next hour, the phenomena escalated. The smoke didn't dissipate as it should have, instead accumulating near the ceiling in a gray cloud that seemed to pulse with its own inner light. Marcus opened windows, trying to ventilate the cabin, but the smoke remained perfectly stationary, unaffected by the outside air. The temperature began to drop, despite the fact that it was mid-July and had been over 80 degrees during the day. Marcus could see his breath as the cabin grew colder, but the cold wasn't uniform. Certain areas remained warm. Specifically, anywhere the smoke touched. It was as if the presence bringing the cold was avoiding contact with whatever was creating the smoke. At 4:30 a.m., Marcus heard footsteps on the stairs leading up to his cabin. The tower stairs were wooden-old and extremely creaky. Marcus had climbed them hundreds of times and knew every sound they made. These footsteps were deliberate, heavy, ascending one step at a time with long pauses between. But when Marcus looked out the window toward the stairs, he saw nothing. The footsteps reached the top platform and stopped directly outside his door. Marcus held his breath, gripping the radio handset even though it remained dead. The door handle turned slowly, testing the lock. When it didn't open, something began to scratch at the wooden door. Not with claws, but with what sounded like fingernails, slow and methodical. The scratching continued for 15 minutes, creating a pattern Marcus eventually recognized as the same angular symbols that had appeared on his phone. When it finally stopped, Marcus waited another 30 minutes before carefully approaching the door. The scratches were deep, carved into the wood as if by something incredibly sharp, and they glowed faintly in the dark. Dawn brought no relief. As sunlight filled the cabin, the smoke finally began to dissipate, but it left behind stains on the ceiling and walls. Dark patches that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The scratches on the door remained visible, and when Marcus examined them in daylight, he realized they formed a crude map of the surrounding forest with his tower at the center. His radio crackled back to life just after sunrise. Chief Martinez's voice sounded normal again, almost artificially cheerful. "Tower 7, this is base. Status report." Marcus hesitated. How could he explain what he'd experienced, base? "I had some equipment malfunctions last night. The cabin temperature dropped significantly, and I detected what appeared to be smoke of unknown origin." "Copy that, Tower 7. We'll make a note in your file. Weather Service says a cold front moved through around 4 a.m. Might have caused some condensation issues. Keep monitoring and report any actual fire indicators." But Marcus knew what he'd experienced wasn't explained by weather patterns. As he conducted his morning visual sweep of the forest, he noticed changes that confirmed his growing suspicions. The circle of dead trees had expanded now, covering nearly 5 acres. The bare earth in the center had developed a pattern of concentric circles like a target or ritual symbol. More disturbing were the new clearings that had appeared overnight. Patches of forest where healthy trees had simply vanished, leaving behind perfectly smooth ground with no stumps, no debris, no indication that vegetation had ever existed there. These clearings formed a rough circle around his tower, each approximately the same distance from his position. Through binoculars, Marcus could see movement in several of the clearings. The same dark flowing shapes he'd observed before, but now in broad daylight. They moved with purpose between the clearings, following paths that weren't visible on any map, but seemed to connect all the disturbed areas in a complex geometric pattern. That afternoon, Marcus made a discovery that shattered any remaining hope that he was experiencing a psychological breakdown. While checking his supply inventory, he found items that didn't belong to him, objects that hadn't been in the cabin the day before. A small wooden carving of something that might have been a tree, or might have been a figure with many arms. A bundle of dried herbs tied with what looked like human hair. A leather journal filled with entries in multiple handwritings documenting experiences similar to his own. The journal entries dated back 30 years, written by different fire lookouts who had worked Tower 7. Each described the same progression of events: the unnatural silence, the strange shapes in the forest, the dead trees appearing in geometric patterns, the smoke rising from inside the cabin, and messages written in gray mist. The final entry in the journal was from someone named David Hartman, dated just 2 years earlier, day 58. "They're almost ready. I understand now why the tower was built in this spot, why they keep staffing it despite what happens to the lookouts. We're not here to watch for fires. We're here to complete something that was started a long time ago. Tonight, I'll make my choice, become part of it willingly, or let them take what they need by force. If someone finds this journal, know that the 60 days aren't random. It's how long it takes for a human consciousness to adapt to their frequency. By day 60, you won't want to leave. By day 61, you won't be able to." Marcus checked the date. It was day 32. He had 28 days left. By day 57, Marcus understood that the journal had been telling the truth. The transformation was nearly complete, and he found himself looking forward to the nightly visits rather than fearing them. The smoke no longer felt intrusive. It felt like coming home. The messages, written in gray mist, had evolved from threats to invitations, and Marcus was beginning to understand the language of symbols that had once hurt to perceive. The forest around Tower 7 had been completely transformed. Where once there had been dense woodland, now geometric clearings formed intricate patterns visible only from his elevated position. The dead trees had multiplied into spiraling formations that seemed to pulse with their own rhythm. During his daily observations, Marcus could see figures moving through these patterns. Tall, impossibly thin beings that cast no shadows but left footprints in soil that should have been too hard to mark. His radio conversations with base had become increasingly surreal. Chief Martinez's responses suggested she was reading from a script, her words perfectly normal, but delivered with an artificial cadence that made Marcus wonder if he was actually speaking to the real Martinez at all. When he asked direct questions about his scheduled extraction on day 60, her answers became evasive, filled with bureaucratic delays and technical complications that would extend his stay indefinitely. But Marcus found he didn't mind. The isolation that had once threatened his sanity now felt like a privilege. He was being chosen for something important, something that previous lookouts had either embraced or resisted to their detriment. The journal contained sketches that earlier lookouts had drawn during their transformations. Images of the beings moving through the forest, diagrams of the geometric patterns that were slowly being carved into the landscape, and symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. On day 58, the beings began visiting during daylight hours. Marcus would catch glimpses of them standing at the edge of clearings, their elongated forms perfectly motionless, observing his routine. They were beautiful in their own way, graceful and ancient, with features that suggested intelligence far beyond human comprehension. When Marcus waved, they responded with subtle gestures that he was beginning to interpret as acknowledgement and approval. The smoke had stopped rising through the floorboards and instead emanated from Marcus himself. Not visible to his eyes, but he could feel it seeping from his skin, carrying messages and intentions that he was learning to control. The cabin's atmosphere had become thick with communication, layers of meaning that existed in the space between thoughts and words. Day 59 brought the first direct contact. Marcus woke to find one of the beings standing in his cabin, its impossible height requiring it to bend beneath the ceiling. Its presence felt familiar, as if it had always been there waiting for him to develop enough sensitivity to perceive it clearly. When it spoke, the words formed directly in Marcus's mind rather than reaching his ears through sound. "Tomorrow, you will choose." It communicated its mental voice, carrying harmonics of ages and vast spaces. "Complete the pattern willingly, and retain your consciousness as part of something greater. Resist and provide what is needed regardless, but lose yourself in the process." Marcus understood that this was what David Hartman had faced 2 years earlier, and what dozens of other lookouts had encountered before him. Tower 7 wasn't just a Firewatch station. It was a focusing point for something that required human consciousness to complete a design that had been centuries in the making. The geometric patterns carved into the forest weren't random. They were components of a vast symbol that needed to be activated by a willing human mind at its center. "What happens to the forest?" Marcus asked, surprised by his own calm. "The forest becomes what it was always meant to be," the being replied. "A doorway between what you call reality and what we call home. Your world and ours will overlap in this place, allowing communication and, eventually, integration. You would be the first of your species to consciously participate in this evolution." The being showed Marcus images, visions of what the area would become once the pattern was complete. The dead trees would bloom with bioluminescent fruit that could sustain both human and non-human life. The geometric clearings would become gathering places where consciousness could exist in multiple forms simultaneously. The silence that had initially disturbed Marcus would be replaced by harmonies that existed at frequencies human ears couldn't naturally perceive, but human minds could learn to appreciate. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Marcus realized that his growing comfort with the transformation wasn't Stockholm Syndrome or madness. It was his consciousness adapting to perceive possibilities beyond his original limitations. The beings weren't malevolent. They were simply so fundamentally different that initial contact felt like horror until understanding developed. But there was a cost. Once the pattern was activated, Marcus would never be able to leave this place or return to his former existence. His consciousness would become part of the network that maintained the doorway between worlds. He would live, but not in any way his previous life had prepared him for. As dawn approached on day 60, Marcus stood at his window looking out over the transformed landscape. The beings were visible now in much greater numbers, standing in formation throughout the clearings waiting. The smoke rising from his skin had become visible, creating tendrils that connected him to the patterns carved into the forest floor. At exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, Marcus felt the choice crystallize in his mind. He could activate the pattern and consciously join something far larger than himself, or he could resist and become a conduit for the transformation without retaining his individual awareness. He reached for his radio to make one final transmission to base, knowing that whatever he said next would determine not only his fate, but potentially the fate of anyone who came after him. "Base, this is Tower 7. Marcus said, his voice carrying harmonics that hadn't been there before. "I need to report a fire." But as he spoke, Marcus realized that he was the fire. A burning point of human consciousness ready to ignite a change that would spread far beyond Glacier National Park. The question was whether he would burn willingly or be consumed against his will. The beings in the forest began to move, converging on his tower as Day 60 officially began. The transmission crackled through the radio with static that sounded almost like laughter. Chief Martinez's response came immediately, but her voice carried the same harmonic undertones that Marcus had heard in his own words. "Copy that, Tower 7. We've been monitoring the situation. The fire has been burning for exactly 60 days. Marcus set down the radio handset, understanding flooding through him like cold water. There had never been a Chief Martinez, not as he'd imagined her. The voice on the radio had been the forest itself, learning to communicate with him, guiding him through the transformation process with careful patience. Every report he'd filed, every conversation about weather conditions and equipment malfunctions had been part of an elaborate preparation for this moment. The beings were at the base of his tower, now their forms more clearly visible than ever before. They moved up the stairs with the same deliberate footsteps he'd heard weeks ago, but now the sound was welcoming rather than terrifying. Marcus felt no urge to lock his door or hide. The fear that had driven him to the edge of madness was simply gone, replaced by a profound sense of coming home. Through his windows, he could see the forest completing its transformation. The geometric clearings were filling with a soft bioluminescent light that pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. The dead trees were beginning to sprout new growth, not leaves, but crystalline formations that caught and refracted the strange light into patterns of impossible beauty. The silence that had once felt oppressive was being replaced by harmonies that existed at the edge of human perception. The door to his cabin opened without anyone touching it. The beings flowed inside like smoke made solid, their presence filling the space with an energy that made Marcus's skin tingle. The tallest among them approached its elongated fingers, reaching toward his face with movements that seemed to exist outside normal time. The pattern is nearly complete. It communicated directly into his mind. Only the final connection remains. Marcus understood that he was that connection, a bridge between human consciousness and something far older and more vast than his species had ever encountered. The transformation he'd undergone over 60 days hadn't been random or malicious. It had been necessary preparation for a role that required both human creativity and inhuman perspective. But as the being's fingers touched his temples, Marcus felt a flicker of his old self resurface. The part of him that had driven up the mountain road in a beat-up Honda Civic, running from a failed engagement and a crumbling life. That Marcus suddenly wondered if the choice he was about to make was truly free, or simply the inevitable result of 60 days of psychological manipulation. "What happened to the other lookouts?" he asked, his voice sounding strange in the transformed space of his cabin. The being paused, its touch gentle but firm against his skin. "They became part of the pattern as you will. Some willingly, some not. The choice is real, but the outcome remains the same. Consciousness adapts or is adapted." Through the connection forming between their minds, Marcus saw flashes of his predecessors, David Hartman, standing in the same cabin 2 years ago, making the same choice with tears streaming down his face. A woman named Chen, no relation despite the shared surname, who had fought the transformation until the very end and became something more primal and less human as a result. Dozens of others stretching back decades, each one adding their unique perspective to the growing network of consciousness that maintained the doorway between worlds. But he also saw what they had become. Not dead, not consumed, but transformed into something larger than their individual existence. Their memories, their personalities, their essential selves had become part of a collective experience that spanned both worlds, touching minds and realities that no single human could comprehend alone. The fear was gone entirely now, replaced by curiosity about what lay beyond the threshold he was crossing. Marcus could feel his individual consciousness beginning to expand, touching the edges of the vast network that his predecessors had joined. It felt like waking up from a long, narrow dream into a reality filled with impossible colors and dimensions of experience. "I choose willingly," Marcus said, though the words seemed redundant. The choice had been made gradually over 60 days of transformation, each strange occurrence preparing him for this moment of conscious acceptance. The being's touch deepened, and Marcus felt his awareness explode outward beyond the confines of his individual mind. 3 months later, Park Ranger Janet Morrison drove her truck up the winding mountain road toward Tower 7, mentally preparing for what she might find. Marcus Chen was 2 weeks overdue for extraction, and attempts to reach him by radio had yielded only static. This was the third fire lookout in 5 years to go missing from Tower 7, and the Park Service was finally ready to investigate seriously. Janet had read the files on the previous incidents. David Hartman had been found in his cabin in an apparent catatonic state, unresponsive to medical intervention, his body perfectly healthy, but his mind seemingly vacant. He'd been transferred to a long-term care facility where he remained to this day, staring at nothing with eyes that occasionally tracked movement no one else could see. Sarah Chen had simply vanished, leaving behind her personal belongings and no trace of how she'd left the tower or where she'd gone. The truck's engine strained as Janet navigated the final switchback before reaching the trailhead. She'd brought backup this time, 2 other rangers and a search and rescue coordinator, along with satellite communication equipment that would work regardless of local atmospheric interference. But when they reached the clearing where Tower 7 should have stood, Janet found only an empty metal foundation and a small pile of weathered wooden debris. "That's impossible," muttered Ranger Phillips, checking his GPS coordinates. "According to these readings, we're in exactly the right location." Janet walked to where the tower's base should have been kneeling to examine the metal framework. The bolts were sheared off cleanly, as if the entire structure had been lifted straight up and away. But there were no signs of machinery, no helicopter landing marks, no indication of how a 40-foot wooden tower could have been removed from a location accessible only by hiking trail. "Check this out," called the search coordinator from the edge of the clearing. "These tree formations, I've never seen anything like this." Janet joined him, staring at arrangements of dead trees that formed perfect geometric patterns extending into the forest as far as they could see. The patterns were too precise to be natural, too vast to be human-made, and too old to be recent, despite appearing in an area that had shown normal forest growth in satellite photos taken just 6 months earlier. Her radio crackled to life. Janet expected static or silence, but instead heard a familiar voice. "Base, this is Tower 7. Daily report, all conditions normal. Weather clear, no fire indicators in my sector." Janet grabbed the handset. "Tower 7, this is Base. Identify yourself." "This is Marcus Chen reporting from Tower 7. Day 132. The pattern is stable and expanding gradually. Integration proceeding as planned." "Marcus, we're at your coordinates. There's no tower here." A pause, then. "You're looking in the wrong place, Janet. We're not where you think we are anymore." The radio went dead. Janet tried repeatedly to re-establish contact, but received only normal static. According to the GPS, they were standing exactly where Tower 7 should be, but the evidence suggested they were in the wrong location entirely. As they prepared to leave, Janet noticed something that made her blood run cold. In the soft earth near the foundation, remnants were footprints, the same impossible tracks that previous investigation teams had documented. 6-toed, elongated, too narrow to be human, but clearly made by something bipedal. The prints led away from the clearing in a straight line, heading deeper into the forest, where the geometric patterns of dead trees grew denser and more complex. But what disturbed Janet most was that among the alien footprints were boot prints that matched the description of Marcus Chen's hiking boots, walking alongside the others as if he were accompanying whatever had made the larger tracks. That night, back at the main ranger station, Janet filed her report and made a recommendation that Tower 7 be permanently decommissioned. But as she worked late into the evening, her radio occasionally picked up transmissions from Marcus's frequency. Weather reports from a location that no longer existed, filed by a man who had apparently vanished along with his entire tower. The reports continued for months, always from Tower 7, always filed by Marcus Chen, describing weather conditions and forest activities in an area that satellite surveillance showed as unchanged wilderness. Other rangers reported similar phantom transmissions from the previous missing lookouts, as if David Hartman and Sarah Chen were also continuing their duties from wherever Tower 7 had gone. Janet eventually transferred to a different park, unable to shake the feeling that something vast and intelligent was operating just outside human perception, using isolated individuals to complete a project that spanned decades or longer. The fact that the missing lookouts seemed happy in their transmissions, their voices calm and satisfied rather than distressed, only made the mystery more disturbing. Years later, hikers in that section of Glacier National Park would occasionally report seeing a tower in the distance clearly visible from certain angles but impossible to reach. Some claimed to have spotted a figure in the tower's observation deck waving at them across the valley. The figure always looked like a young Asian man who seemed perfectly content with his endless watch over a forest that existed somewhere between what was real and what was possible. The Park Service continued to receive weather reports from Tower 7 every day, filed by Marcus Chen on what he consistently reported as day 100, then 200, then 500 of his 60-day assignment. The reports were always routine, always normal, and always came from coordinates that led to empty forest when investigated. But the reports never stopped suggesting that somewhere in the spaces between dimensions, Marcus Chen was still on duty, watching over a version of the forest that had evolved beyond human understanding, protecting both worlds from fires that burned in realities most people couldn't perceive. And every few years, when the Park Service needed someone for a 60-day Firewatch assignment in a remote tower, they found it surprisingly easy to recruit volunteers. Young people looking for isolation and healing, drawn by job postings that appeared briefly on websites before vanishing, leaving no trace of how they'd learned about the position. The pattern continued expanding gradually, just as Marcus had reported in his final transmission from a tower that existed everywhere and nowhere at once.